Welcome. How is everyone? It's really a joy to have all of you here, and it's really a joy for me to be here and share this book with you. And I also want to thank Jon for coming, who has been one of my heroes for a long time. And I want to tell you a little story before we get started. But before I tell that story, I always have to remind myself to thank a few people. And certainly one are the people who help put these events together. And I would like to thank them. First of all, where are some of those people? Wherever you are, I thank you. You know what sometimes we forget is that for us to lead our lives, it requires the efforts of a lot of other people. And when we somehow take that for granted, we actually lose, because when you look at those people and recognize those people, you realize actually how lucky you are to have those people. So it's something I always try to keep in mind. The second thing is I want to thank my wife and children and my mother-in-law and father-in-law. And because without the support of those who love you, it's also impossible to do anything in this life. The other people I would like to thank, and two of them are here in the front row, are the benefactors to the work that we do here at Stanford. And without them, the center would not be possible. The work that I do would not be possible. And so I'm very, very appreciative of that. And Ming, if you could stand up, he's one of our wonderful benefactors. Who has really supported this work from the very, very beginning, and his support has really been instrumental in making my work possible, so I thank him. Has there anybody in this room I have not thanked yet? So thank you all. So tonight we're going to have a conversation, and it's really wonderful to be here with Jon, who I don't have to introduce because I think he's known to probably everyone in this room, in fact, much more than I am. But the interesting thing is that Jon was kind enough to write a blurb for this book, and after reading the book, he actually sent me probably the longest email I have ever gotten from him. And actually, to show you the type of person he is, he very thoughtfully wrote down a number of his thoughts and how he felt and was moved by different aspects of this book, and actually asked me some deep, penetrating questions, and we sort of went on in this dialogue. But at the end of this note, he apologized, and something along the lines, if I recall correctly, this is probably one of the longest emails I've written. I don't usually write emails this long. And then he ended it with something along the lines of, the reason that is because this book so profoundly affected me, which is really quite wonderful. So if you don't mind, I thought, before we actually begin this conversation, that I might read a little bit of the book. Would that be okay with you guys? I started this book with this introductory chapter, and it's called Beautiful Things. But it actually talks about an ugly thing. And I'm going to read that to you, and then we'll start this conversation. Now, I have to tell you, and anybody who's attended my events, I can get tearful and emotional, so that's probably going to happen. So what can I tell you? Beautiful things. There's a certain sound the scalp makes when it's being ripped off of a skull, like a large piece of Velcro tearing away from its source. The sound is loud and angry and just a little bit sad. In medical school, they don't have a class that teaches you the sounds and smells of brain surgery. They should. The drone of the heavy drill as it bores through the skull, the bone saw that fills the operating room with the smell of summer sawdust as it carves a line connecting the burr holes made from the drill. The reluctant popping sound the skull makes that is lifted from the dura, the thick sac that covers the brain and serves as its last line of defense against the outside world. The scissor slowly slicing through the dura. When the brain is exposed, you can see it move in rhythm with every heartbeat, and sometimes it seems you can hear it moan in protest at its own nakedness and vulnerability. Its secrets exposed for all to see under the harsh lights of the operating room. The boy looks small in the hospital gown and is almost swallowed up by the bed as he's waiting to enter surgery. My Nana prayed for me, and she prayed for you too. I hear the boy's mother inhale and exhale loudly at this information, and I know she's trying to be brave for her son, for herself, maybe even for me. I run my hand through his hair. It is brown and long and fine, still more baby than boy. He tells me he just had a birthday. Do you want me to explain again what's going to happen today, champ, or are you ready? He likes it when I call him champ or buddy. I'm going to sleep. You're going to take the ugly thing out of my head so it doesn't hurt anymore. Then I see my mommy and Nana. The ugly thing is a medulloblastoma, the most common malignant brain tumor in children, and it is located in the posterior fossa at the base of the skull. Medulloblastoma isn't an easy word for an adult to pronounce, much less a 4-year-old, no matter how precocious. Pediatric brain tumors really are ugly things, so I'm okay with the term. Medulloblastomas are misshapen and often grotesque invaders in the exquisite symmetry of the brain. They begin between the two lobes of the cerebellum and grow, ultimately compressing not only the cerebellum but also the brainstem until finally blocking the pathways that allow the fluid in the brain to circulate. The brain is one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen, and to explore its mysteries and find ways to heal it is a privilege I have never taken for granted. You sound ready to me. I'm going to put my superhero mask on and I'll meet you in the bright room. He smiles up at me. Surgical masks in operating rooms can be scary, but today I will call them superhero masks in bright rooms so I won't be afraid. The mind is a funny thing, but I'm not about to explain semantics to a 4-year-old. Some of the wisest patients and people I have ever met have been children. The heart of a child is wide open. Children will tell you what scares them, what makes them happy, what they like about you, and what they don't. There's really no hidden agenda, and you never have to guess how they really feel. I turn to his mother and grandmother. Someone from the team will update you as we progress. I anticipate it will be a complete resection. I don't expect any complications. This isn't just surgeon speak to tell them what they want to hear. My plan is for a clean and efficient surgery to remove the entire tumor while sending a small slice to the lab to just see how ugly this ugly thing is. I know both mom and grandma are scared. I hold each of their hands in turn, trying to reassure them and offer comfort. It's never easy. A little boy's morning headaches have become every parent's worst nightmare. Mom trusts me. Grandma trusts God. I trust my team. Together, we will all try to save this boy's life. After the anesthesiologist counts him down to sleep, I place the boy's head in a head frame attached to his skull and then position him prone. I get out the hair clippers. Although the nurse usually preps the surgery site, I prefer to shave the head myself. It is a ritual that I do. And as I slowly shave the head, I think of this precious little boy and go over every detail of the surgery in my mind. I cut off the first bit of hair and hand it to the circulator to put in a small bag for the boy's mother. This is his first haircut. And while it's the last thing on his mom's mind, now I know it will matter to her later. It's a milestone you want to remember. First haircut, first lost tooth, first day of school, first time riding a bike. First brain surgery is never on this list. I gently cut away the fine light brown strands, hoping my young patient is able to experience each of these firsts. In my mind, I can see him smiling with a large gap where his front tooth should be. I see him walking into kindergarten with a backpack that's almost as big as he is, slung over one shoulder. I see him riding a bike for the first time, the first thrill of freedom, pedaling feverishly with the wind in his hair. I think of my own children as I continue to clip his hair. The images and scenes of all his firsts are so clear in my mind that I can't imagine any other outcome. I don't want to see a future of hospital visits and cancer treatments and additional surgeries. As a survivor of childhood brain tumor, he will always have to be monitored, but I refuse to see him in the future as he's been in the past, the nausea and vomiting, the falling down. The waking in the early morning hours, screaming for his mother, because the ugly thing is compressing his brain and it hurts. There's enough heartbreak in life without adding this to the mix. I continue to gently clip his hair, just enough so I can do my work. I make 2 dots at the base of his skull where we will make our incision and draw a straight line. Brain surgery is difficult, but surgery in the posterior fossa even more so, and in a small child, excruciatingly difficult. The tumor is large and the work painstakingly slow and precious, eyes looking through a microscope for hours, focused on one thing. As surgeons, we are trained to shut down our own bodily responses as we operate. We don't take bathroom breaks, we don't eat. We have been trained to ignore our backaches and our muscle cramps. I remember my first time in the operating room assisting a famous surgeon who was known not only for being brilliant, but also for being belligerent and an arrogant prima donna. I was intimidated and nervous, and I stood next to him in the operating room, and sweat began pouring down my face. I was breathing heavily into my mask, and my eyeglasses began steaming up. I couldn't see the instruments or even the operating field. I had worked so hard, overcome so much, and now here I was, doing surgery just like I had always imagined, but I couldn't see a thing. Then the unthinkable happened. A large drop of sweat rolled off of my face into the surgical field. He went ballistic. It should have been the highlight of my life, my first time in surgery, but instead I contaminated the surgical field and was summarily kicked out of the operating room. I have never forgotten that experience. Today, my forehead is cool and my eyesight clear. My pulse is slow and steady. Experience makes a difference, and in my operating room, I am not the dictator or a belligerent prima donna. Every member of the team is valuable and necessary, everyone focused on his or her part. The anesthesiologist monitors the boy's blood pressure and oxygen, his level of consciousness, and the rhythm of his beating heart. The surgical nurse constantly monitors the instruments and supplies, making sure whatever I need is within reach. A large bag is attached to the drapes and hangs below the little boy's head, collecting blood and irrigation fluid. The bag is attached to a tube connected to a large suction machine and continuously measures the fluid so we know how much blood loss we have at any given moment. The surgeon assisting me is a senior resident in training and new to the team, but he is just as focused on the blood vessels and the brain tissue and the minutiae of removing this tumor as I am. We can't think about our plans for the next day or hospital politics or our children or our relationship troubles at home. It is a form of hypervigilance, a single-pointed concentration, almost like meditation. We train the mind, and the mind trains the body. There's an amazing rhythm and flow when you have a good team, everyone in sync. Our minds and bodies work together as one coordinated intelligence. I am removing the last piece of the tumor, which is attached to one of the major draining veins deep in this young boy's head. The posterior fossa venous system is incredibly complex, and my assistant is suctioning fluids as I carefully resect the final remnant of the tumor. He lets his attention wander for a second, and in that second, his suction tears the vein. And for the briefest moment, everything stops. Then all hell breaks loose. The blood from the ripped vein fills the resection cavity, and blood begins to pour out of the wound of this beautiful little boy's head. The anesthesiologist starts yelling that the child's blood pressure is rapidly dropping and he can't keep up with the blood loss. I need to clamp the vein and stop the bleeding, but it has retracted into a pool of blood and I can't see it. My suction alone can't control the bleeding, and my assistant's hand is shaking too much to be of any help. He's in full arrest, the anesthesiologist screams. He has to scramble under the table because the little boy's head is locked in a head frame prone and with the back of his head opened up. The anesthesiologist starts compressing the boy's chest while holding his other hand on his back, trying desperately to get his heart to start pumping. Fluids are poured into the large IV lines. The heart's first and foremost job is to pump blood, and this magical pump that makes everything in the body possible has stopped. This 4-year-old boy is bleeding to death on the table in front of me. As the anesthesiologist pumps on his chest, the wound continues to fill with blood. We have to stop the bleeding or he will die. The brain consumes 15% of the outflow of the heart and can survive only minutes after the heart stops. It needs blood, and more importantly, the oxygen that is in the blood. We are running out of time before the brain dies. They need each other, the brain and the heart. I'm frantically trying to clamp the vein, but there's no way to see the vessel through all the blood. Although his head is fixed into position, the chest compressions are now moving it ever so slightly. The team knows, and I know, we are running out of time. The anesthesiologist looks up at me, and I see the fear in his eyes. We might lose this child. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation is like trying to clutch start a car in second gear. It's not reliable, especially when we are continuing to lose blood. I am working blind. So, in that moment, I open my heart to a possibility beyond reason, beyond skill. And I begin to do what I was taught decades ago, not in residency, not in medical school, but in the back room of a small magic shop in the California desert. I calm my mind, I relax my body, I visualize a retracted vessel. I see it in my mind's eye folded into this young boy's neurovascular highway. I reach in blindly, but knowing that there is more to this life than we can possibly see, and that each of us is capable of doing amazing things beyond what we think is possible. We control our own fates, and I don't accept that this 4-year-old is destined to die on the operating room today. I reach down into the pool of blood with the open clip and close it, and then slowly pull my hand away. The bleeding stops, and then, as if far away, I hear the slow blip of the heart monitor. It's faint at first, uneven, but soon it gets stronger and steadier, as all hearts do when they begin to come to life. I feel my own heartbeat begin to match the rhythm on the monitor. Later, in post-op, I will give his mother the remnants from his first haircut. And my little buddy will come out of the anesthesia a survivor. He will be completely normal. In 48 hours, he will be talking and even laughing. And I will be able to tell him that the ugly thing is gone. I'm sure that nobody got emotional over that, did they? This is my 6-year-old. He said, you did, which is true.
Well, let's take a moment and just resonate in the aftermath of what we've just heard and felt. Because this kind of writing is actually really, really, really rare. Especially from a neurosurgeon. And it's one of, I notice most of you have not read this book yet. You have quite an adventure in front of you, because while this was extremely graphic and profound and moving, the whole book is like that in a million different ways. And it was, I couldn't put it down as soon as I picked it up. In part because of that story, but in part because of the way it was unfolding and the voice in which it was unfolding. And then the story and the metaphors and the literal magic shop and then the metaphorical magic shop. When I first saw the book, it has the picture of the brain on the cover, beautiful picture of the brain. And I just naturally thought, before reading it, well, that's the magic shop. And it is the magic shop, but it's not the only magic shop. So part of what I found so compelling about this book is that you discovered something at a very young age, long before you became a, accomplished neurosurgeon at Stanford and all your other accomplishments. You discovered something at the age of 12, I think it was, in, as you said, the desert of Southern California. And desert should be understood both literally and metaphorically, and unsparingly described in this book in a way that oriented your entire life and allowed it to recognize a certain kind of intrinsic value that there was no way that you were going to recognize otherwise, it feels, in reading the book. And so, wow, what kind of adventure is that? That's just unbelievable. And it's very, very rare that you'll come across a story that's this unbelievable that's actually true. Seriously. And so I just sort of bow to you deeply for whatever it took to live the life that's described in this book and continue the trajectory of it at this moment in time, and to then share it with the world in a way that, I gotta say, and again, like maybe this is sort of not something I should say, in this context, but this isn't just a great story about how great Jim is, or how difficult his life was, or how well it's turned out because of certain kinds of lessons that he learned. It is riveting and compelling, but it's much more than that. It's a kind of exemplar in a certain way, or of an invitation to understand that what he encountered in the magic shop was someone who cared enough and who recognized something in him enough to give him a kind of a gift that only works if you continue to nurture it, to exercise a certain kind of muscle, so to speak. And so the true magic of this book, I hope, is that it's going to transform people's lives way beyond just thinking of Jim as a great person. Again, seriously, because this is a kind of karmic assignment, so to speak. Now, we're all probably well along on that path. I'm sure many of you are. But there's something about, whether you're on that path or not, there's something about this book that I think can help you reorient it, fine-tune it, or re-energize you to remember that, hey, why wait until you have a brain tumor to wake up? I mean, now is the only moment we have, and there's a certain kind of architecture to that cultivation, and he learned it at age 12 for, if I remember correctly, only 6 weeks, and then implemented it as a discipline improbably for his entire life, really, which partly means losing it from time to time, but nevertheless, your entire life. So, I mean...
Well, thank you, John, for that. Well, you know, it's interesting because when I give talks or I sit up on a stage like this, oftentimes there's an assumption that, geez, everything was perfect and my life has been great. And the reality is, though, there are very, very few people who've gone through life without significant pain and suffering. And oftentimes we project that everyone else's life is together and our life sucks. And the problem is, I think, and I hope what this book helps with, is that as we grow, especially as children, what happens is there is the creation of a conversation or a dialogue in your head, and that it remains with you. And for those of you who haven't read the book or know much about it, my background is one where I grew up in poverty, and my father was an alcoholic, and my mother was an invalid, and she had had a stroke and was partially paralyzed and was chronically depressed, tried to commit suicide multiple times. My father was in and out of jail. We were on public assistance. And so when you grow up in that environment, it's very chaotic and dysfunctional and actually, frankly, quite painful. And what happened to me was that at 12, I walked into this magic shop because I had an interest in actually magic. And it's interesting because when I walked in, there was this woman named Ruth who was this, I call her an earth mother type. Do you guys know what I mean when I use that term? Yes, we all know what it, right? And she was, and you also meet people who have like this radiant presence, and she had that as well. And it turned out she was the owner's mother. The owner wasn't there. He was running an errand, and she was there. And she knew nothing about magic in this magic store. But after a conversation where she actually asked me some fairly penetrating questions, and I was already becoming a delinquent because of the nature of my background. When you don't have any possibility to change your life, or at least you think you don't, you have nothing to lose anymore. And so that's really the position I was in. And after a period of conversation, about 20 or 30 minutes, she said to me, I really like you. I'm here for 6 more weeks. If you show up every day, I'll teach you something that I think could change your life. And I showed up. And frankly, I wish I could tell you because I had this incredible insight because I'm Jim Doty now, right? But it wasn't. It's because I had nothing else to do. And I did show up. And over that period of time, this incredible person taught me a set of lessons. And I tell people that prior to this, I felt like a leaf being blown by an ill wind. You just are going here and there and everywhere, and you have absolutely no control. And from that interaction, though, it changed my perception, and really it was my first experience with neuroplasticity. It changed my perception of having limited to no possibilities to have unlimited possibilities. And that interaction with that one person changed the trajectory of my own life and brought me here before you today and taught me a set of lessons that are accessible to anyone. And this isn't to say that, you have point A and B and you want to get here and you just have the straight line and God, life is great and everything works out, because that's not what is here. It goes like this, okay? But you can get to point B. And really, that's the fundamental message here, to recognize your own suffering, to be with it, to change that dialogue that you sit with and that's oftentimes very negative, and understand, as in my case, it wasn't the events that were causing my pain and suffering, actually, because my situation did not change after I had the 6 weeks with this woman. They were exactly the same. But what changed? How I reacted to the situation. And how you react to the situation changes everything. Because oftentimes the way you react with the outside world, based on how you're feeling and the pain that you're suffering, that profoundly affects the dynamic of how people interact with you.
There's so many levels to your experience. One aspect of it that you alluded to even in the brief passage that you read is that it's not just about the mind, it's about the heart. And there's some very dramatic events that unfold in the book that remind you of a lesson that actually didn't fully penetrate the first time. Is that not correct? And maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how the head and the heart speak together, speak to each other, and need to speak to each other for compassion and wisdom to emerge.
Yeah. Remember, I was 12 years old, and, at that time, what I thought was important, because when you grow up in poverty, what do you want? Especially if you have a chaotic life. You want money, because you think money gets you control, right? And so that really was what I was focused on. And it's interesting, in the book, Ruth, the first part of what Ruth taught me was really to relax the body and to understand the tenseness that was going through my body a lot of the time. And be able to relax, which then allowed me to be focused and be attentive. And then the next step was to understand this constant dialogue that was going on in my head. And it was a created dialogue that really wasn't beneficial to me, because it was composed of how people interacted with me. And when you grow up in poverty, a lot of times you're dismissed. As a child, when you have difficult circumstances, you translate those circumstances into something that you have done. So you have this, and this happens to many, many people, where this DJ, as I use the term in this book, has a station that you just are listening to. And the problem is, listening to that station results in this really negative emotional response, and it creates a sense of stress, anxiety, oftentimes depression, because it chronically engages what we call your sympathetic nervous system. And what she allowed me to do was to not necessarily turn it off initially, but to not react to it. Then the next thing was to turn the volume down and ultimately to change the station with positive affirmation and actually being compassionate to myself and recognizing that, like all human beings, we are frail, we are fragile, and that's the nature of life. And that's okay. And also that each of us has a dark side, and that's just the way it is too. And then over time to change that voice, and then that allows you to see the world in a different way, because you're no longer emotionally reacting, and because you're not doing that, it allows you to interact with people in a different way. the next part was what Jon was alluding to, which was to open your heart. And here's where I lost it a little bit, because in my desire to have control and power and money, that's really what I focused on. But she told me early on that the most important thing was to have an open heart. And that open-heartedness is possible when you stop beating up yourself and you look out and you see that oftentimes the people who are interacting with you in a negative way, they have their own burden they're dealing with. And it allows you the opportunity to forgive and to hold those people and not respond to those people in a negative way you might have. And of course, these are not lessons that, especially as a 12-year-old, you embrace immediately. They take time, they take repetition, they take experience. But what happened, as Jon was alluding to, is that I got lost thinking that what defines success, and this is what happens with so many people, and it's actually quite sad, is that they chase after what society defines as success, which is money, position, power. And I had every one of those things. I remember I was living in a big house. I had a penthouse overlooking at the top of a building in San Francisco. I had a Ferrari, and I had the pleasure to, and I won't close my wife's ears here, but I had a number of interactions with very attractive women. She was one of them ultimately in the last one, but so that's good. But but you know, in the face of all of that, though, I was the most unhappy I had ever been in my entire life until I met her. And the reason was because I was chasing after something that gave no nutrition, and I was still empty and hungry, but I didn't understand until everything changed in my life, and that was the gift that made me understand and recognize that the most important lesson that Ruth taught me was to have an open heart. And what happened was I had been very successful in the dot-com era, and I was at Stanford, and I was running a company as well on the side. And I had this, I was buying an island, I had a villa in Florence, I was driving my Ferrari. I thought I was a very handsome, charismatic guy. And that's how I found her, apparently, too, my son told me. But what happened was, in a 6-week period after the dot-com crisis came, everything was gone. And I went from having about $70-some million to being minus $3 million. And, you know, at that time, the banks would love to give you a credit line, which I happily took. And as soon as you lose everything, who's the first person who knocks at your door? And they're not being particularly compassionate, are they? It's the bankers. And so I had to essentially give up everything. Now, I don't want to imply, because it would be an insult, frankly, to say that, geez, my life was ruined. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm a neurosurgeon who gets paid more than 99.9% of people. You know, it's interesting. Oprah called me because there's a story in the Wall Street Journal about this, right? And I'll tell you the other part that put in the Wall Street Journal. But so Oprah's show called me. They said, "Oh my God, your life must be horrible. You've lost everything. You've had to sell your penthouse, your Ferrari, blah 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 blah." And she goes, "Are you like living in your car or what?" And I'm going, "No, I'm still paid more than 99% of people. And frankly, my life has not changed that much. I mean, and so I'm blessed. I'm thankful." And they go, "Oh, well, this isn't going to make a good story." But the turning point came, it wasn't so much the losing, But it was the next step of this story, which is I had made some commitments to charity, and because I thought I was going to have all this money, and I wanted to be a philanthropist, and I really felt an obligation from my own success. And but now I had nothing. So the only thing I had left was stock in a company that had yet to go public, of which I had been the CEO. And so I'm sitting there agonizing over this, going, God, I have no assets. I've given all the stock away, et cetera, et cetera. I have nothing. And then I got a call, actually, telling me that, in fact, the law firm had actually not completed the paperwork, and I didn't have to give it all away. So I could not live up to that obligation, and this happens all the time, actually. I find out later. But I didn't give up that obligation. And since the company hadn't gone public, I had no idea what the value of that stock was worth. But I made an active choice to give away every bit of that stock that I had in that company that I had been the CEO of. And the reason I did that was because, after deep reflection of my own situation and the reality that nothing I had attained so far had filled that empty space, I decided to walk away from whatever I had that was left. Well, long story short, that company went public for $1.3 billion. Now, in the Wall Street Journal, I had an article to tell you the rest of the story. By this time, we had married. But in that article, they had actually interviewed her, because that's what the article was about, was that I gave away now tens of millions of dollars to charity. And my wife now said, I really don't mind him being so generous. I just wish he hadn't given everything away. But that's what wives are for. But what that did was, though, that giving that away and living up to that was really one of the most incredible gifts that I have ever been given, because that gift made me actually go back and understand with absolute clarity what Ruth was trying to teach me. And it subsequently has allowed the creation of the center that studies the neuroscience of compassion. That's one of the most, if not the most well-known center in the world that does this. It's made me a life, really, that is so filled with joy. It has allowed me to meet, and if you haven't gotten the book or looked at the book, some of the most incredible individuals in the world, not only Jon, who I have immense respect for, but the Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh, Desmond Tutu, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, and have actually relationships with these people who are really some of the most enlightened people in the world. And the reason they're so enlightened isn't because of their dogma. It's because they understand the power of the heart to change your life. And that's really what this book is all about.
Well, maybe it might be valuable to hear a few more words about ccare, since we're here and since it's such a kind of important emergence in the world. How does ccare function? Just enough so people can know. And how does it relate to what is the kind of effect that it is now having on your life, having made these decisions? You mentioned some of it in the book, but not that much. So again, it might be really interesting for people to hear a little bit of that connection. So,
as all of you know, Stanford's one of the most compassionate places in the world. It's not
supposed to be a joke.
I had periodically left Stanford, as an example, one, to run this company for a while, but I decided to leave again, And then when I came, I then decided to come back. And when I came back, my intention was, because it had finally percolated to the surface, this desire to really understand how the brain and the heart function, this connection, and the physiologic effect mental states have, specifically in regard to compassion and altruism. And so I came back to Stanford, and I initially started some conversations with some individuals in psychology and neuroscience. One of them, or two of them, are sitting over there. One completely dismissed me and laughed at me and told me to leave his office. But you know, I have to be honest with you. When I said, geez, I really want to study compassion, I think this is fascinating, some people looked at me askance, and frankly, they said, well, if you have money and you pay for it, we'll consider doing it. And that's how it started. But the people who ultimately got engaged really got engaged because they saw how powerful this connection is. And, you know, I'm not a religious person, although apparently every religious leader I know somehow believes I am, but I keep telling them I'm not. But that's okay. One day I was walking through campus after I had begun this initial research work with some of my colleagues, and it just popped into my head that I should invite the Dalai Lama here to come and talk about compassion. And I was not a follower of the Dalai Lama. Frankly, I had no interest in religion in general, and I have no clue to this day why that popped into my head. None. Obviously, you know, he is an icon of compassion. He is loved by, you know, hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. But at that point in time, I really did not know that with clarity. My wife had actually had an interest in him, and she would go to some of his things, and I would drop her off and leave and not stay. And he had been here in 2005. I'm telling you this story for a reason, because it's really absolutely critical to how all this manifested. He had been here in 2005, and I tracked down the people who had invited him, and as you will see in this book, I can be somewhat persistent. I tracked down the person who invited him, which led me to a conversation with his primary English translator, Thupten Jinpa, who many of you may know if you know the Dalai Lama. And this led to a meeting. And it was extraordinary because at this meeting, which lasted far longer than was scheduled, I explained to him this initial work that had begun with some researchers here at Stanford, and my goal to really understand compassion and how it manifests and how we can cultivate it in individuals because it is so powerful. And he immediately got onto it. As many of you may know, he's interested in neuroscience. He'd been working with scientists who study meditation. And I said, would you consider coming to Stanford? And he immediately agreed. I mean, immediately agreed. And it's interesting because he called in a monk into the room, and I thought that the monk would bring his laptop and flip it open and type in, you know, the schedule type of thing, because they want to pick a date. Well, this monk comes in with this ledger that's like this. And it like goes like this, and it just... And anyway, we pick out a date. He agrees to come. And then I'm sitting there, and I'm like processing this because it's really quite extraordinary. And then Jinpa, his translator, begins this very animated conversation in Tibetan. Of course, I don't speak Tibetan, and I'm sitting there going, oh my God, did I piss off the Dalai Lama? Because, you know, it's going on, and they're jumping around, and I'm like, and at the end of that conversation, Jinpa turned to me, and he said, His Holiness is so moved by this effort you've begun, he wants to make a personal donation. And at that time, it was the largest donation he'd ever given to a non-Tibetan cause. And then it immediately led to two other individuals, one right here in front of me, to give a significant amount of funds to help support the creation of the center, which is now manifested to be this incredible center that does fundamental research. We have actually developed compassion cultivation training programs. And in fact, amazingly, now Jinpa lives in Montreal. He runs his own institute to translate Tibetan classics. He follows His Holiness wherever he needs an English translator. But for 3 years, Jinpa worked with me a week a month here at Stanford to develop this program. Can you imagine that? And it has become a very powerful program that is now taught throughout the world. And we've also developed a compassion skills training program. And two of the individuals who've been involved in that, can you two stand up? These two individuals have developed a compassion skills training program that I also believe will ultimately have a profound effect. Because what we find is when we cultivate these mental states with intention, it has a profound effect on our physiology. Not only to decrease our blood pressure, decrease our heart rate, boost our immune system, decrease our stress levels and the release of stress hormones, but it also increases our longevity. And I also tell people what it does, it actually makes you understand the meaning of life or transcendence. Because the gift that you're giving from these practices is it allows you to embrace people and an outward journey of connection. And that is what ultimately gives meaning in our lives.
Okay, I'll take a moment to simply point out that the idea that there would be a center for compassion and altruism education and research on a premier university campus 15 years ago would have been considered like the Visigoths are at the gates about to tear down the citadel of Western civilization. Compassion was not considered a worthy subject for scientific inquiry in any field. It was not considered to be an emotion. The same for mindfulness, the same for a lot of the kind of meditative practices were in some sense considered to be voodoo, or say if you were a graduate student and you wanted to study meditation or compassion, and you happen to mention that to your thesis advisor, that was like shooting yourself in the head, not in the foot. That up until about 10 years ago, that would have been what they would call a career ender. Okay? Now, before coming here, I just met with a whole group of bioscience graduate students here on campus, and they were all deeply into mindfulness. They're deeply into meditation. They're deeply into compassion. And they're cultivating these things. And it's now being understood, as Richie Davidson likes to say, compassion isn't a good idea. It's a skill. It's not something you either get or you don't get. It's something that you can cultivate through exactly the kinds of exercises that Ruth taught you in that magic shop. And it does require exercising a certain kind of muscle. It's not like just like divine intervention. You have to, in some sense, care enough to pour yourself into your own life in a way that's not a prisoner of your own emotional reactivity, as you were describing, and to learn an entirely new way of being in wise relationship with the actuality of your life, which is, as you said, not always so pleasant, and sometimes a hell of a lot scarier than that. So I think that this book comes at a very sort of signal and seminal moment, because one embodies it in a story that's like just incredibly compelling. But at the same time, it's coming out of Stanford, neurosurgery, neuroscience, the ccare. And it's also part of a sort of larger global unfolding that you're pointing out, where these deep meditative practices that have been around for thousands of years are coming together with the sort of highest levels of scientific inquiry and humanistic inquiry, I might add, as well, of scholarly understanding, but that's not just the scholarship of the head, but the scholarship of the heart. And in some sense, what's happening is that your book is contributing in a powerful way to, I think, a kind of flowering and a flourishing of a new way of understanding actually what it means to be human, what it means for me to be human, whether I was born in the desert in Lancaster, California, or whether I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth, or however. What does it mean to live a life of integrity, of ethical integrity, of clarity, of wisdom, of kindness, and of deep meaning? And no one can give that to you. Unless you're incredibly lucky and you're 12 years old and you happen to sort of be bored out of your skull and you wind up in a magic shop in the desert. But for the most part, the way you're going to get it is, to the degree that you don't already have it, is by reading this book or by taking some...
I did not pay him.
No, you didn't. Or by taking any one of the infinite avenues that are now available that weren't 30 or 40 years ago. 30 or 40 years ago, they were not available. Now they're everywhere. And so it's as much an invitation as it is a celebration. And I find that incredibly uplifting and reassuring about the fate of our species and the possibilities for the sort of a global renaissance, if you will, that truly honors the beauty and down-regulates the greed, the hatred, and delusion that is not all in those other bad guys out there, but is in every single one of us, and where we need to be able to put that right out there front and center, not pretend we're some perfect being, as you said, but to live in a way that actually stretches into the possible. And, I would say that that's not an unworthy undertaking at this particular moment in time for any of us. And hopefully the book will catapult you into a new level of enthusiasm for yourself and only the rest of the world. So we should go to questions, okay? And so why don't we take questions? There are microphones in the corridors. I don't know if there's a microphone up there. Is there a microphone in the balcony? So you'll have to shout if you're in the balcony. If you want to ask a question,
microphones?
My suggestion is to come and line up at the microphones and we'll dance between the two. And if you're upstairs and you have a pressing question, come downstairs and stand online. And we'll do the best we can in terms of time.
Yes, sir.
Ruth was certainly a rare individual. I was wondering if you ever learned what the source of her wisdom was, and if you've been in touch with her after you were 12 years old.
Well, it's a common question, and I remember I was 12 years old, and so
You have to keep saying that.
yes, and so I never saw her ever again. Now, what I found out later is because I really looked in and researched this book, because frankly, sometimes I thought I had created a narrative in my head. But it turns out that she was from Ohio, and she actually died of breast cancer. Now, one interesting aspect which is talked about in the book, though, which may sort of connect here, is that her son was divorced from his wife. She lived in elsewhere, and they had I think, an 11-year-old son. And Ruth had actually come out that summer to spend time with the son who was supposed to be visiting the father that summer, and the two of them, the mother and the father, had gotten into an argument, were estranged, and she refused to send him there for the summer. So probably in some way I may have become the stand-in for the gift that she wanted to give her son. So, yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Michael Penn, and I am deeply grateful to both of you. I admire your brains and your hearts. So my question really is to both of you. I'm an entrepreneur working with a company that is seeking to bring or leverage artificial intelligence to build compassion between people. And so I wonder, as we think about scaling CCT and other consciousness technologies, what your view of technology is in terms of transmitting on a vastly larger scale.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. I'm actually doing an event on the 16th of March, and it'll be advertised soon, actually on artificial intelligence, machine learning, and compassion.
We should talk.
But it is interesting because what's happened is that, and it's sort of a strange coming together of the humanities and science, because as AI becomes more critical in our existence, moral philosophy becomes just as critical. And that's actually what the discussion is about. And how do you imbue these robots with humanity? And that's actually going to be one of the most critical questions over the next few decades. And it will give humanities majors jobs, actually, in the new in the new economy.
Finally.
So that's actually wonderful and exciting, but that is actually going to be critical. So look for that. So, but it is, we actually did a program with an individual who designs computer interfaces specifically based on an ethical, moral framework in terms of its interaction with the people who are signing on. But we can chat more about that if you send me an email. Yes, ma'am.
I just wondered how you could spread care and compassion to, say, like the refugees and try to do something about the Middle East and ISIL.
It's, thank you for that simple question. It's horrible, and it's horrible to watch, and it's horrible for us, so many of us, to feel as if we're helpless in that situation. I don't have an answer for all of this. One of the challenges that each of us has, though, is that oftentimes we feel that there's so much suffering in the world, how could I possibly alleviate that suffering? What can I do? Either you're not famous, you don't have financial assets, you don't have resources. And that is often very, very true. But what each of us can do every day is to make the life of one person better. And if that is your focus, if that is your intention, that is all you can do. And that will change. I believe, as Jon was saying, and as I talk about in the book, we're at the start of an age of compassion. But it's going to start with little ripples in the ocean, little drops. But those drops will coalesce and ultimately form a tsunami. And each of us can be part of that tsunami by just providing that one drop.
I would just say, if I could respond just very briefly, say that it's really important for us all to continue asking ourselves that question. Because simple dime store answers are not going to be of too much value. But to be able to hold in our hearts the enormity of what we're seeing. Not since World War II have we seen the displacement of that many people. And of course, then there was not like the 24-hour news cycle, so it's in your living room and on your phones and dead babies. And, this is colossal, and it's stretching everybody's heart and resources. And if it were happening in the United States, we would not look any prettier than the European Union is looking at the moment, if we would even look that good. So these are very serious questions that have to be dealt with. And the more mindfully and the more heartfully the people who are making those kinds of decisions can deal with them on the global, political, sort of geopolitical level, and individual people opening their hearts and their homes to people who which is happening all over Europe. And although it may not be in the majority, that's an enormous act of compassion and generosity that's going on. And it's not yet been resolved, but it is very much in play. And the more we orient towards the caring and the kindness as opposed to the kind of contracted protect myself at all costs or protect the borders of the country or whatever it is, the more we will actually find a way, I'm convinced, to let our humanity rule in this kind of situation that, of course, nobody wanted at all, and is to a very large extent, I might say, a product of our own deluded foreign policy over decades, if not centuries, in terms of the understanding of political lines and factions in the Middle East.
Well, and I would just simply add on that, remember, a lot of this is artificially created for a purpose, right? It's to separate, divide. And I think that if we can, again, with intention, not be led astray, and we have some people proposing living in fear, always that there's threat, to be manipulated. Because when you're fearful, you, as John was saying, you pull in, and you're not kind, and you want to separate yourself from the other, and you stop recognizing that the other is you. So I think it is critically important, and in this country right now, we're going to have a juncture where we have to choose between fear and openness.
And they're running for president.
Hi, my name is Sarah McDevitt, and first, thank you both. I am someone who's been able to benefit from the research and the way that people are talking about mindfulness, because I was one of those grad students who said I want to study mindfulness with teenagers in public schools, and my advisor did not kick me out, so I've benefited from that. My question is maybe simple. For people who are coming across this research and seeing, these are results of meditation and mindfulness and compassion, and these are benefits, and I want those, and people who are very results-driven, who then maybe try a mindfulness meditation once and have these large expectations. What is your approach in just like what is the first thing you say to them to kind of let them be patient with
I
that?
think it was Mao who said that the journey of 1,000 leagues begins with a single step. And so Jon Kabat-Zinn says, and if you get off on the wrong foot on that journey, you're going to stay on the wrong foot for the whole thing. So this is where the quality of the teaching is really important from the get-go, not like down the road. And so I think we really, in my view, the cultivation of mindfulness, the cultivation of compassion, really need to be understood as not something that you acquire, but an intrinsic capacity that emerges as you get out of your own way. So one is striving just the way we strive for wealth or power or, some end result that we are attached to but don't really understand. Enlightenment, for instance. And the other is to trust that you're already whole, and that if you learn how to be in wiser relationship to this moment as it is, not some phantasmical, sort of dream, then you're starting off on the right foot, and you keep practicing and exercising the muscles that way, and the world then becomes your meditation teacher.
Thanks so much for your thoughts. I don't like talking in these forums, but I feel compelled to give a defense for the humanities and social sciences, because when you say that people haven't been thinking about compassion at Stanford until the last 15 years, I feel it does undo 500 years of scholarship, 1,000 years of scholarship, and that we do get jobs, and that people who are employed in humanities and social sciences have done a lot of work. The fact that neuroscientists are now measuring it is wonderful, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't happening in the first place. So, Thank you.
Yeah, well, to quote from some of William Shakespeare's ancient scientific work, this wasn't invented 10 years ago. And we need to keep that in mind.
And actually, that's not what I said. I was talking about the research on compassion, specifically referring to neuroscience. Obviously, the foundation of our civilization is based on the humanities. So I don't want you to think I discounted that. So I'm very, very aware of that. And go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'm a leadership student, and so what I'm really interested in is the implications of compassion in the leadership industry. And I know that's a huge deal, but I thank you so much for your work, both of you, and for calling it out as a skill that can be trained in addition to the practice that it is. And I'm just really excited to do something with leadership and compassion at the same time.
Well, I think now that we have become more clear about what these practices entail and their power, a number of individuals have been creating programs specifically for training leaders in these skills. And whether it's John's work or my dear friend in front of me, Ming, who's developed Search Inside Yourself, the work that we're doing, it's really spreading over the globe and is actually quite powerful. And when you look at the effects, you see this increase in productivity, and if you want to talk in capitalist terms, increase in shareholder value and return on investment, because sometimes that's what CEOs look for. But really, this should not ever be thought of as a way to do that. That isn't the end point. What the end point is to give people meaning in their life that allows them to reach their potential as a human being.
And I would just add one thing, and that is that maybe we need to bring greater mindfulness and compassion to how we language things. So the sort of very thought of a leadership industry I find absolutely terrifying, and that we need to sort of understand that leadership is not a product, and you can't just sort of stamp out graduates in leadership. It's a way of being in wise relationship to possibilities that maybe only few people see, but actually maybe live within all of us. And then a leader is somebody who manifests that. There's no script for that, as you well know. So we need to actually transform the institutions that think that they're doing the cutting edge work on these kinds of things.
Amen. Thank you for that.
Well, John preempted my surprise question a few minutes ago, but I was going to say that to get to something really basic, who are you guys supporting for president? I mean,
John?
You want to respond to that?
Yes.
Well, it's not time to vote for president yet. But if Bernie is running for president on the Democratic ticket, Bernie has my vote big time.
Yeah. It's interesting. Day before yesterday, I was with Glenn Beck. Do any of you know Glenn Beck?
Yeah. He blurbed your book.
He did.
I noticed.
Yes.
Not the usual kind of person blurbing this kind of book.
But my point here is he and I were having actually a conversation about Ted Cruz. Now, everything I hear out of Ted Cruz is like the spewing of the most vile right-wing Christianity excess, right? At least that's how I view it. But it was interesting, and it shows you different people's perspectives, because Glenn is telling me, oh no, Ted isn't against homosexuals. Ted isn't against abortion. Have you ever heard him not? I mean, it's the most, what? And he said, well, no, he's sort of a federalist and believes in the Constitution and is sort of a libertarian. And I looked at him and I was about to spew, are you out of your mind? But the thing, though, is that what you have to remember is you cannot change people's mind through force. It never changes. By reaching out to Glenn and actually developing a personal relationship with him, it allows us to sit and have a conversation based on trust that makes him thoughtful, and people like him to look at a different viewpoint and respect that. And as an example, I had to sit through part of his show as I was waiting to have my conversation with him. And there was one of his people on the stage with him said something like, "Did you see that the federal prison is having to pay for transgenders to have sex change operations," or something like this? And he goes, "My hard-earned dollars." And, so then he comes off, and he and I began this conversation. I said, "Did you hear what you just said?" I said, "Each of those people who you're talking about, who've committed suicide, who've lived this horrible life," I said, "did you choose to be a heterosexual?" I said, "Each of those people has a mother. Each of those people has a humanity." And then he looked at me, and he started processing that, you see? Because I was able to talk to him as a friend, and not to say, "You vile, hateful person." But I have to tell you, again, when you sit down with somebody and you're able to share that and you have that conversation, it may not completely switch them over, but at least it allows you to have that conversation. So I try to keep that in mind, because doing it any other way and trying to do it in a forceful way never changes minds.
Are you Linda? Are you
Thank
Linda?
you, John. I just wanted to add or ask if this is true, that when Bernie Sanders was asked if he would give one word that would characterize either his presidency or his values, that word was compassion. Did you hear that? Anybody hear that?
Yes.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sir.
So Mark Abramson,
Yes.
who teaches
Absolutely. I know
MBSR at
Mark.
Stanford.
Thank you. I don't know how to follow that, but I just want to say how beautiful you two look up there together. And I want to take this opportunity to thank John, because of him 20 years ago, I was able to found the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Clinic here at Stanford. And it's hard to believe that next year will be 20 years. And it came out of your brilliance and your heart and your soul that the door opened to make this possible. And I see so much potential, particularly you two sitting together here and having this conversation. So I guess my question is how, to each of you, how do you see mindfulness and compassion, the work that ccare is doing, the work that mindfulness doing, joining together to create a better world and human potential transformation?
Well, it's interesting, because I talk to a lot of very wealthy people, and sometimes when you talk about compassion, it's an interesting conversation, because it's not thought of as something hard. It's thought of as this sort of fluffy thing that really isn't something. And the reality, though, is, and I submit to you, that is ultimately what is going to save our society and our species and, frankly, this earth. And what I'm hoping will happen is, by continuing to do the work that I do, and I think that John does, that the importance of this will continue to be recognized, even with what John has done over the last 30 years and the power of that fundamentally has allowed me to do what I'm doing today as well. And I acknowledge and thank John for that, and I think we should all do that. So I think that if each of us keeps trying to move this huge rock a little bit, or boulder a little bit further, ultimately we'll reach the top of the hill and be able to roll it down the hill, and it's just time. But it will happen.
And I just want to say, Mark, first, thank you for your kind words, and really what you're seeing unfolding here, and you know this very well, I mean, because it's at the heart of MBSR, certainly at the heart of compassion, just listen to the language, is that this is a love affair. From the beginning, if you want to build something that has value at Stanford, the 20 years next year of MBSR, and then develop it and find the connections with the work that's being done at ccare and so forth, those connections are infinite already. It's just a matter of deciding which ones we're going to sort of nurture or put our energy into or prioritize, if you will. But it's really a love affair with the potential for human beings to recognize who we are in our fullness and transform in such a way and heal the wounds of childhood, of life itself, and of the politics, in ways that actually optimize well-being and minimize harm and violence. And there's no script, just as like there's no script for leadership, there's no script for how that's going to emerge. But I really want to bow to you for having just made it happen here on campus and affected so many people's lives over these years. And the synergies it feels to me like they're way beyond anything that we can conceptualize. Yes, we need to fund things, we need to nurture them and so forth, and hopefully that will all be part of the emergence. But the most important element of it, and the part that is most easily lost, is the love piece. And just taking your seat to meditate is a radical act of love, in my view. And then connecting with other people and seeing the beauty in them and not having it all be about me, that's a radical act of sanity and a radical act of love. And whether you're doing it with Glenn Beck or whether you're doing with Rush Limbaugh or sort of George Bush, when you don't make separation, you already have healing. And that doesn't mean that you get stupid or that you get lax or that you get wimpy or dumb. But it does mean that you understand how to, in some sense, dance with all of the various currents of how the world works and make them, in Wordsworth's phrase, move in one society. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there. My name is Julie Scott. I'm a nutritionist, and I use mindfulness and compassion in my work with individuals. And by doing that, I see how they shift individually. And my question to you is, using the ccare program in Silicon Valley, how do you see, what is your vision for shifting the corporate culture or the technology culture? What have you seen shift perhaps from the work you've done, or the vision for how things could shift moving forward?
Well, I think what happens is these types of courses, and CCT specifically, one of the hardest things for people to do is to have compassion for themselves. And so many of us spend, unfortunately, so much time beating up on ourselves that it's hard to accept people even be nice to you, and that destroys lives, and it doesn't allow you to live up to your potential. And by giving people,
you can sit with me,
Alexander, by giving people a set of tools that this is my son here who's 6. He's
come on up.
By giving people a set of tools where they can understand this, and then that allows them to be compassionate to themselves, and then that allows them and gives them a tool set to actually be compassionate with others. I mean, I can't tell you the number of people, I'm sure this has happened to John as well, where people, after taking these types of courses, say, you have profoundly changed my life, or their spouse or a loved one comes up and says, I don't know what you've done, but they are completely different in how they see the world. And giving somebody that gift is just such a joy and an honor, because these things change lives. And it changes, as I was talking about earlier, how you see the world, how you respond to the world, changes how the world responds to you. And that's really the power and the gift of these things, I think.
Thank you.
We have 0 minutes, it says.
Go ahead.
Okay, last question.
I'm Nancy Stone, and I moved here from Boston.
Turn it down towards you. Yeah.
I moved here from Boston recently, 3 years ago, and I knew John from up there and used his services. But my point is, we have a new neuroscience gallery hospital on campus, and it deals with all kinds of sciences and brain work and so forth. is it possible for you to have some place in there to do your work to help the people with Parkinson's that must have meditation in their life, and Alzheimer's and lots of other areas? Is there a way that you can integrate your work over there?
You mean at the Neuroscience Institute here?
Right.
Well, we actually, believe it or not, there are a lot of programs and discussions going on as we speak in this regard. You know, unfortunately, Stanford sometimes is a bureaucracy, and it moves extraordinarily slow. But I will just tell you, I was at an event with the Dean of the School of Medicine who actually spent a fair amount of time commenting on this book and the importance of these types of values. And we are moving the needle. And with Mark's work, who was just talking, and the work that we're doing in terms of the medical school and the faculty, it's changing that. We have had a ton of fellows and residents take this training, and it's profoundly impactful. And also, this compassion skills training, we are integrating it into training nurses and doctors and giving them tools to give them greater resilience and decrease burnout. And we offer it also to patients with chronic disease as well as patients with cancer. So these things are happening. They may not be as visible as either you and I would like, but they are happening slowly. And they're happening all over the world, actually.
Yeah, but you're a leader here at Stanford.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Let me just say in closing, what an honor it is to be here this evening for me and to be in dialogue with you, Jim, in this way and about such a kind of seminal contribution to the world. And I do hope you all read the book because, you know, it's going to speak to you in ways that are, in some sense, unimaginable and at the same time reconnect you with maybe the 12-year-old in yourself. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.